Go ahead, Rennie.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the Native Prairie Restoration and Reclamation Workshop. My name is Rennie Grills, and I'm the Resource Management Officer. And I've been on the planning committee for this year's conference, and I've been actually involved with this conference for many years. So it's my pleasure to be the moderator today for today's or this morning's workshop. I'd like to start by stating that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these people as the original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples of Canada today. This morning's session is about habitat. And for myself, I've had a long career working for many conservation organizations across the 3 prairie provinces, dealing with everything from prairie restoration to land management and to working with producers and landowners. And habitat is really important for many aspects of society, especially here on the prairies. It provides habitat for species at risk, for our regular biodiversity of all species, but also provides functional landscapes for our agriculture producers, ranchers, and livestock producers. And so today we're going to be talking about different aspects of habitat and looking at it from many lenses, both from species at risk, from wildlife to Indigenous peoples' uses of the land, and how the value and the importance of these habitats. So this morning we have 3 presentations, and they're all habitat related. One from the perspective of agriculture, one from industry, and one from a general restoration perspective, just like the other 2 days. So there's a few housekeeping items. One of them, the whole gamification codes. And there's still a few prizes left. I checked them out this morning. And so make sure you get those codes and scoop up those remaining prizes. There's a great picture there from donated by SODCAP, and I highly recommend get your points there so you can grab those some of those prizes. And my wife and myself, we own Blazing Star Wildflower Seed Company, and we donated a few prizes, and I noticed that those were scooped up already. So thanks everyone for participating and getting those points in there. So today is the last day of the workshop, and make sure that you go and check out those trade show booths and the posters. And at noon today, go out there, try and connect with the people that are in the trade show. There are very important sponsors for this workshop and that help make this workshop happen. So make sure you reach out and connect with those people. The posters will continue to be up on the virtual platform with the recorded presentations, but there won't be anyone to answer those questions afterwards. And just a reminder that there will be case studies this afternoon, and you can pick which case study you would like to actively engage in. And really with these case studies, it's that active engagement is where you learn the most. So I really encourage you to really become engaged in these workshops or in those case studies. All case studies and wrap-up discussions will be recorded and can be viewed at a later date if you don't have the time to actively participate in the case studies this week. Any handouts you might need to complete the case study will be available on the platform as well. Also, as this is the last day of the workshop, we'll be sending out evaluations for you to complete. They are very, very important to the planning committee. And we review them very carefully and consider the suggestions and input for future events. So yeah, we really encourage you to do those forms. I know we go back even to 2 or 3 years in the past from this conference to go back on those evaluations for determining what future workshops should be. And also at 3:30 is our closing session, and we ask everyone to try to join us because we'll have the announcement of the NPRR grant and also the closing remarks. Also, I'd like to take this time to thank Carolyn and Caitlin for their hard work and dedication for the Native Prairie Restoration and Reclamation Workshop. Their hard work and dedication and sort of guiding the steering committee on getting this conference off the ground. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to do it. So if you get a chance, pop them a message or send them an email to thank them for their hard work. And before I hand it over to our first speaker, I would just like to let you know that you hide the sessions or the dashboard on the left of your screen, or you can go to full screen. So there's a little way to pull up your screen to full size so you can see better. And I would like to remind you that you can type in questions at any time, and especially in the Zoom question box. And that way, the speakers will only be answering those questions at the end of their presentation. The Q&A chat boxes in the feed loop will not be moderated, so make sure you put your questions in the Zoom chat and the question and answer section. Also, if you have general or networking comments about the session or the workshop, those can be put into the public group chat on the right side of your screen, but also the feed loop public chat will not be monitored during the presentations. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, and our first speaker is Roy Vera. Roy is a postdoctoral fellow working with the Plant Community Ecology Group at the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. His current work focuses on analyzing the impact of fire on the forage quality in the mixed grass prairies to contribute to the general goal of using fire as a management tool in rangelands. I've had the pleasure of working with Roy the last year or so on several prescribed fires in the Saskatoon area, both at University of Saskatchewan's Kernan Prairie and also with Meewasin's Northeast Swale. So it's my pleasure to introduce Roy. So Roy, I'll get you to share your screen.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen right now.
Perfect.
Do I see the screen? Okay.
I see. Okay, thanks, Roy.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Rennie, for the introduction. It was actually my pleasure working with you guys, Meewasin and the University of Saskatchewan during last year. Yeah, and thank you, everybody, for being here for this presentation. Yeah, so yeah, I'm very happy to be part of this workshop and to contribute a little bit with additional information regarding rangeland management. And specifically today, I'm going to talk about the contribution of non-legume forbs to forage quality in a general way into the mixed native grasslands. This is a project I've been working on during last year in 2021, and hopefully some results may be of interest for the audience. Okay, so let's keep going. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna break a little bit the traditional way of presentations by acknowledge first some people and institutions deserve from this work, starting with several people at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Eric Lam, a principal investigator and professor at the Department of Plant Sciences, and his lab comprised by several grads and undergraduate students that significantly contributed in the development of this work, particularly Sarah Grover, Angie Lee, Laura McMillan, Hela Haidomako, and in general other people in the Plant Community Ecology Lab at the University of Saskatchewan. And a special thanks to several funding agencies, such as the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, the Beef Cattle Research Council, and the governments of Saskatchewan and Canada. Yeah, without their funding, this project wouldn't be successfully developed. Now, I put a couple of pictures here so you can see. At the top of the screen, you can see one of our prescribed fires that we developed at the Kernan Prairie last year. This prairie is located at the northeast of Saskatoon. And you can see here Dr. Lam looking carefully at how fire is being developed in this area, while myself, I'm trying to ignite this fire. Yeah, worth to mention that last year was my first year as a postdoc, and I'm really excited for looking forward for next challenges and projects that come next. And below, you can see another photograph of some grads and undergrad students are ready to start the evaluation in one of our experiments in Burstal, which is located at the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. Now, let's get to the point. Probably everybody is aware that grasslands are being impacted by several environmental stresses, particularly the higher values of temperature and variation in the precipitation are affecting the productivity of this beautiful landscape. So I put this very short animation for you guys to see, provided by NASA. And basically, what we're gonna see here is changes in the temperature for the last 130 years. As you can see here, some blue colors represent colder areas, and the yellow, orange, and red colors represent warmer areas at global scale. But I want really you guys to notice here is that this temperature rising really started to take off around 1970s. And at global scale, temperature started to rising, and particularly located at the northern latitudes, as you can see here. So the Arctic zone of Canada, Siberia, Europe, Greenland, and are having higher values of temperature compared with other parts in the world. Now you can see here at the right side of the slide, the Great Plains in North America. And it is very important, this area, because of its size. And it goes from Canada to the north, goes across the United States, and goes into the north part of Mexico. So these Great Plains, their geographical location may be limited by the interaction between temperature and precipitation and other environmental variables. And in fact, there are several studies suggesting that they are originated here because of their tolerance to certain periods of droughts. However, with the increase of the temperature, it certainly have affected the productivity of these grasslands, particularly affecting the livestock production. Now, just to provide an example of grassland receiving impacts of climate, there are several studies suggesting that in the long term, grasslands are going to decrease in terms of productivity. This is a study showing that they projected the NDVI, which is basically an index reflecting the green color in the landscape. So green color means more plants. And of course, the greener the area, more plants, meaning more productivity. And according to this work, another works as well, project that, for example, in the Great Plains in North America, it is projected that the productivity is going to decrease, as noted by the orange and red colors. Now, precipitation and temperature influences grasslands ecosystem beyond primary productivity. For example, if we're going to have fewer plants in the Great Plains, that probably will affect fauna presence as well. For example, insect pollinators. And with reducing the amount of fauna in those areas, will certainly affect the ecosystem stability and the resilience of these areas to climate change. Where resilience means that this area will no longer be able to recover after several disturbances, such as wildfires and grazing. And of course, with important implications for agriculture and livestock production. Now, farmers may have observed several impacts of climate during the last years. For example, they may have seen increase in with longer periods of droughts, and of course producing, giving us less productivity when these environmental conditions limit the growth of preferred graminoids. As you know, graminoids are the preferred plants that typically contribute in terms of forage amount of biomass to cattle, and also in terms of nutrient quality. However, the question remains is, how can we overcome these environmental impacts on grassland productivity? And there are several studies suggesting that including native plants into the pasture systems may buffer the effect of severe droughts, because these native plants are somehow tolerant to longer periods of drought. And also recently, it's been introduced the use of prescribed fires as a management tool to prevent wildfires effect. You know, prescribed fires are controlled fires, while wildfires are uncontrolled fires and can severely affect grasslands. Now, less information is being developed in terms of forage quality, particularly the impact of climate on this topic. So that's why we were making a lot of efforts to fill that knowledge gap of how climate is affecting forage quality in grasslands. So that's why in this talk, I'm going to talk about 2 projects I've been working on during last year. The first one is about seasonal patterns, seasonal variation of the forage quality in 6 selected native forb species. In this project, excuse me. In this project, we were looking at to evaluate the seasonal variation in nutritional quality of 6 selected common native forb species for the whole growing season. And hopefully this information may help farmers to guide as a guide for a species selection for the inclusion in perennial mixed pastures. So these 6 forbs were common yarrow, Achillea millefolium, which is I really like this forb. It's very smelly and very showy plant. And this is another abundant forb, smooth aster. It's a showy plant with blue flowers. And the famous prairie crocus, which is really nice as well. We have Solidago canadensis or Canada goldenrod, which is very showy plant with yellow flowers. We have the prairie rose and Vicia americana. So you may notice here that prairie rose is a shrub and Vicia is a legume. So those are 2 different functional groups of plants. Basically, we included these 2 to compare the results with the other 4 non-legume forbs in this project. Now, samples were collected in the Kernen and Bidulph prairies in a weekly way, at least, for the whole growing season from May to October in 2020. So these 2 prairies are located, as you can see here, these red dots, Kernen at the northeast part of Saskatchewan, and Bidulph at the south part of Saskatchewan, so just below Beaver Creek. And also for the project, we use data which is already published from Bell and other collaborators, which they developed a very intensive work at the Kernen Prairie. So they collected several samples of forbs and grasses and provide a different type of data, but we use only for our purpose. We use values for crude protein, NDF, and ADF. For those who are not familiarized what NDF and ADF means, basically they refer to the amount of fiber in grasses and forbs. And yeah, so NDF represents neutral detergent fiber and ADF acid detergent fiber. Now, let's get to the results. First of all, I want to show you the average seasonal percentage of biomass each of these functional groups show out of our data. And in the y-axis, we have the percentage biomass here. So starting with graminoids, we can see that the native prairies are contain highly amount of grasses. So that's why they are called grasslands, right? And they contribute with about 37% of biomass. So it's a really high amount of biomass they provide. And we can see in terms of forbs, other than legumes, they contribute into the mixed prairies in average seasonal with about 19 to 20% of biomass. In terms of legumes, it represents with less than 1% of biomass. So we can see here, although it's not part of this talk today, that shrubs also contribute with more than 40% of biomass to the prairies. Now, the key point here is that non-legume forbs provide a substantial amount of biomass in the native prairies. So it's really important to consider in case cattle can have additional food source for them. So, and another result we have here is that non-legume forbs provide a substantial amount of biomass throughout the growing season. So we can see here in this diagram, the seasonal percentage of biomass divided through the whole growing season from May to November. And we can see here in terms of graminoids that it looks like there is a very steady line of a percentage of graminoids from May to August. It increases a little bit in September and then before decreasing very deeply at the end of the growing season. When we compare with forbs, it looks like this particular functional group increases from May to August, and then it's kind of stabilized this amount of biomass from August until the end of the growing season. So please note here, and it's really interesting that when graminoids decrease the amount of biomass, forbs remain stable so they can provide additional food source to cattle at the end of the growing season. Just to note about legumes as well, it looks like they have a very low contribution in a seasonal way from May to October with less than 1%. And just for everybody to know how shrubs behave around the season is that basically they have a lot of contribution at the beginning of the growing season, decrease significantly until October, and then increase again at the end of the growing season, which makes sense because other plants start to die, right? Now, this slide probably represents one of the main results in this talk. And basically it shows the percentage of crude protein for the 6 forb species selected in this project. So we evaluate in terms of crude protein for the whole growing season from May to October. And each line with different color represents the different 6 forb species. So one of the things that we can see here is that there is a general decline in protein. So that was expected through the growing season. So you can see here that the levels of crude protein at the beginning of the growing season is very high with an average of 20%, and then they start to decrease until the end of the summer. But we can notice here that 3 out of the 6 forbs, Visia, goldenrod, and smooth aster, they maintain higher levels of protein even at the end of October. So these 3 forbs maintain more than 6% of protein at this point, which may significantly contribute to the nutritional requirement for cattle, even at the end of the growing season when other type of functional groups of plants like graminoids start to decrease, especially in terms of nutritional quality. Now, what about fiber content? So here I have 2 slides showing neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. So this basically, just to give them a general idea of what this basically means, is that when we have higher levels of fiber, that means low levels of digestibility in the cows, for cows, right? So the lowest level of fiber, the best is the result in this case. And we can see here that there is a general increase in fiber over the season, which makes sense because plants start to get old. So there is more fiber content in the plants at the end of the season. But we notice here that smooth aster and goldenrod represent one of the lowest values of fiber, even at the end of the growing season compared with the other 4 selected forbs in this project. So this is really important to see because these 2 forbs may represent a very good choice to introduce in seeded pastures because they have higher amount of protein and also they have high levels of digestibility. And just besides the fact that forbs may provide significant amount of protein and biomass, I wanted to show you that they also, including forbs in the prairies, may improve the quality of the habitat. So I have this slide with this very technical diagram, so I'm not going to get into it. But basically, this is used for people who work in taxonomy and to show how plants have evolved. But I wanted to use this diagram to show the difference between graminoids and forbs, and because graminoids are represented in the group basically for the monocots, while forbs are represented into the eudicots. And this is very, very important to notice because in this particular group, they have different floral structures. So the flowers are different compared to the graminoids. They have several structures which produce a different reproduction biology. So because they require the presence of pollinators in order to reproduce. And as such, with the increasing amount of pollinators, of course, the diversity of fauna is going to increase. So the key point here is that if we introduce forbs into the pasture, into the mixed prairies, we may improve the habitat quality in this area. So that may be, we may receive positive feedbacks while with the, we can improve the stability of the ecosystem and the resilience of the grasslands as well. So just to provide some key messages from this project, that forbs other than legumes are a major component of grasslands biomass. They may enhance the distribution of forage and available nutrients throughout the growing season, and they also may improve the habitat quality and food sources for pollination. Yeah, those are the key messages from this project. And if the audience want to go deeper in this topic, you can check our paper in the Canadian Journal of Plant Sciences, which was published last year. Now, let's talk about the second project I've been working on, impacts of wildfires and grazing on forage quality. So this work was a collaboration between the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Alberta. And basically here, we were aiming to investigate to what extent wildfires basically induce changes in the forage quality in native prairies. So you may know, or you may remember that in October 2017, there were two big wildfires that burned across Alberta and Saskatchewan. And these two wildfires are located here, as you can see in these two maps. Those black spots represent those wildfires. And you can see these little branches here that they may show the direction of the wind. So the wind pushed that fire into those areas. And as a general idea here, there were burned around 28,000 of hectares, and where I think more than 8,000 hectares of pasture were burned. So there was a significant effect here. And we used these sites for our research purposes. So there were established around 12 sites across the location of the wildfires for sampling. So they were established born and unborn sites, and also grazing and non-grazing exclosures to see what is the effect of these factors into the levels of protein. For sample collection, they were collected every summer for 4 consecutive years after the wildfire. That means from 2018 to 2021. So this data is pretty new. So this is, yeah, we are just finalizing our analysis. And grasses and forbs basically were collected by separate. Each of them were dried, ground, and later processed for crude protein and fiber. So you can see here this photograph showing one of the grazing exclosures. So there is a fence. Of course, the intention here is that cows cannot go inside of this site and eat the grass. So we can see the effect of grazing as well. And in the middle of the of this grazing exclosure divides the born site and the unborn site. So this is just an example of one of these sites. We have another example here of the sites. This is outside of the non-grazing exclosure. And we can see here that there are several people ready to collect some samples. Yeah, so some results here. One of the first results we found is that we didn't find any grazing effect. So there is no difference between grazing and no grazing in terms of crude protein. We did find some differences between born and unborn, but the interesting thing here is that there is no immediate effect on crude protein 1 year after the wildfire. So you can see here, this y-axis represents the crude protein, and is dividing the result between born and unborn for every year of collection after the wildfire. So the red part represents the born, and the green part represents the unborn. So after analyzing this data, we find that there is no significantly differences, I mean, statistically speaking, between those two factors at the first year, which is really interesting because there are several studies suggesting that actually born sites may have higher levels of protein 1 year after the wildfire, but this is probably not the case. Now, it's interesting here that we found that the effect is actually seen at the year 2. So we can see that crude protein levels are higher at the second year in born sites compared to the sites that were not born, as you can see here. When we analyze the third year after the born, there is no significant effect, again, of the fire on crude protein, and the same happens at the year number 4. So it looks like there is the only effect happens at year number 2. When we analyze the multi-year changes in level of protein, we found that effectively in year number 2, the levels of protein in general is higher compared with the year number 1. When we compare year 2 versus year 3, there is a significant effect by decreasing the level of protein in year number 3 compared with year number 2. When we compare year number 3 and year number 4, we found out that there is no significant effect. So that would represent a stabilization of the crude protein. We don't know. So we're still maybe going again this year to evaluate if this trend keeps going that way or it changes. Okay, so and another result we found here is that there is no effect of fire on functional groups of plants, but there is some effects between those two functional groups. We didn't find any effect in the levels of protein between forbs and grasses in 2018. As you can notice here, there is no significantly differences statistically speaking. In 2019, again, there are no significantly differences between those two functional groups. In 2020, however, we found significantly differences as well as in 2021. And especially they are located in grasses where they have less level of protein compared to the forb functional group. So this is really interesting. If you remember, in years 2020 and 2021, they were particularly dry. So this may provide evidence that forbs looks like they have more tolerance to longer dry periods, as they maintain higher levels of protein compared to grasses. So in general way, forbs preserve more crude protein than grasses under drier conditions. And they may be providing a good evidence that including forbs into the mixed prairies may represent a good option to buffer the effect of longer dry periods. Okay, so just general messages from this project is that there is no immediate effect of the wildfire on protein content in grasses and forbs, and the post-born effect occurs after the second year. So as you notice here in our results, the crude protein value seems to stabilize at the third year post-born. So we found that that the first year there is no immediate effect of the protein. 1 year after the wildfire, there is a significant effect in the second year, but after that, it seems to stabilize in levels of protein. And forbs may provide a buffer effect on protein content in mixed prairies under drying conditions, as you notice from our last slide. So the final message from this presentation is that I could say with a certain amount of confidence that including forbs in seeded pasture may increase the options for food for cattle, particularly if environmental conditions limit the growth of preferred graminoids. And also, when more diverse plant communities may produce positive environmental feedbacks that influence landscape health. So introducing forbs and produce a more diverse plant community in grasslands may increase the stability of the ecosystem in general and increase the resilience capacity of this ecosystem to recover for severe disturbances such as wildfire and longer periods of drought. So in general, that's all that I have for you guys today. And I really appreciate your listening, and thank you for being here for this presentation.
Okay, thank you, Roy. Yeah, if you have any questions, please enter it into the Q&A chat. Roy, there is one question right now from Jessica. So her question is, for the first part of your talk, you only have 1 year of biomass monitoring. Do you think that the climate of the given year could change how grasses and forbs grow? And since you looked at in your second, since you looked at that in your second portion of your presentation.
Definitely. Yeah, 2020 was a very exceptional dry year, and that certainly have affected the results in our project. So we're looking at that carefully, but in general way, we can see that if those dry conditions, still those forests are projecting that levels of protein, we can see that under normal years, they may have even higher levels of protein. So we're talking about that those results are basically result from those years that were particularly dry. But still, we need to evaluate another year to see if that is still happening, and to make sure that actually precipitation may have an important role in the levels of protein. Yes.
Thanks, Roy. Comment from Elaine was curious. Yarrow is very undesirable in cow pastures because it tends to give cow's milk a bitter taste. And that was just a comment from Elaine. Comment from John Morgan, and a question actually. John says, "Hi, Roy, great presentation. Can you suggest additional forb species you would like to add if you had a chance?"
Well, there are several forb species in the grasslands. Like, there are. We only evaluated 6 because those are the most abundant species in the mixed prairies. So that's why those were selected. But there are several options that we haven't looked at those. And basically because of the absence of those forbs in the prairies. But other forbs that, well, I don't have any at the top of my head right now, but definitely we can take a look at those, particularly those that have lots of leaves. Maybe a good option to include in this type of project to evaluate what is the response in the levels of protein. Yeah, I don't have a name right now, but yeah, I may look that maybe later. Yeah.
Thanks, Roy. And yeah, I just have sort of a little side comment. I've noticed anecdotally the smooth aster where we have growing in some of our wildflower plots, the deer really go after the smooth aster till about August, end of August. Then they quit browsing it, and then it allows them to start flowering after that. So there must be something with the tannins or something in it that it also, there's that shift after the first frost that they quit grazing. Yeah. But I really noticed that very popular for browse for deer, and also with the goldenrods. So yeah. Another question from May Alsinger. She has legumes are more accessible for including in pasture seed mixes for a number of reasons. So, purple prairie clover, other legumes like that. How would you try and convince a livestock producer to plant forbs instead of legumes?
I think legumes are a very good choice for including in seed pastures. And yeah, as you said, there are a number of reasons for that. They are very palatable. And so cattle are very trained to eat those because they really like those type of forbs. But the point here is that we're trying to homogenize the plant community only using legumes and grasses. The key point here is that we're trying to diversify the mixed prairies here by introducing additional forb species different than legumes for several reasons. That first of all, they increase the levels of fauna. So different forbs other than legumes have different flower structures that attract different types of animals, especially pollinators. And with that, they may increase the stability of the ecosystem. And also, another important point of introducing forbs other than legumes is that they are very, very tolerant to drier conditions. So if we introduce those forbs, we may be affecting in a positive way the whole grazing system to produce more biomass for cattle, especially at the end of the growing season. Even though, of course, they may produce lower level of protein compared with legume forbs, there are other aspects that we may consider, such as those that I have said already. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks, Roy. Another question from Jennifer. She says, could forbs be maybe higher than grasses based on the time the biomass was harvested, since the asters and goldenrods start growing later in the year?
Sorry, can you say that again, Rennie?
Yeah, so the protein levels in forbs may be higher than grasses based on the time of the year when the biomass was harvested, since asters and goldenrods are more of a late growing species.
Yes, absolutely. They some of them, yeah, they may show a higher level of protein, depending on what type of grasses as well we are comparing with. But of course, when they are starting to grow, they tend to present more levels of protein. So that's an interesting point, because some forbs, as you said, they start to growing at the beginning of the growing season, others start to growing at the middle of the growing season. And that's really important because they provide an additional option for food with very good quality, even higher probably than other grasses. And that may be a good contribution for that to fill the requirement for cattle.
Roy, in your study, you were looking at prairie crocus as well, right? And
yes.
Since that's an early species, so you had pretty much the whole range of species. Okay. Question from Shirley Bartz. Shirley says, thank you, Roy, very cool subjects. Do you have any comments on the possibility that fire intensity might have different results on protein levels in grasses and forbs? These wildfires were really high intensity. Are you aware of other studies looking at less intense fires with different results in crude protein post-burn?
We are working right now on a meta-analysis, trying to collect several information on different fires and prescribed fires, and how severity and the intensity of these can affect different levels of protein and the diversity of the plants as well. So yeah, I'm looking at right now, and hopefully some results will come next in the next few months. And we're happy to share those results with people who are interested about that. But yes, I believe the intensity of the fire may severely affect, or at least that's my guess, that the intensity of the fire can severely affect the levels of protein, because if more intense fires can produce warmer areas in the soil, they can reduce the amount of nitrogen in the soil. And of course, that cannot take up into the plants, of producing less quality into the plants.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roy. Comment from Clinton Blythe. He says, can you tell my cows to eat goldenrod? Antelope and sheep may benefit, as well as non-cattle wildlife. Also, did you measure, so the question is, did you measure effective rainfall and average mean temperature at the sites you sampled for your research?
Well, not right now. We are still evaluating those variables, but we haven't evaluated the impact of the rainfall right now into those effects. So I don't know right now what is the outcome of that, but we can definitely consider in our analysis. But definitely, the precipitation plays a really important role in the levels of protein. So it is several studies suggest that increasing the levels of precipitation may increase available nutrients for plants, and definitely that's going to increase probably the levels of protein in those forbs.
Okay, thanks, Roy. Next question from Thai Don. Recently, we learned about the importance of biocrust. That was one of our sessions on Monday morning. Will you consider it as part of the vegetation for further assessment, like biomass, nutrition, etc.?
For further assessment, can you say that again, because I didn't catch that question very well?
So the question is regarding biocrusts. So, that thin layer of vegetation, well, different fungus and other items, I didn't answer that correctly, but would you consider that as part of the vegetation for further assessment? So comparing biomass, nutrition, biocrusts as part of this evaluation?
That's an interesting point. We haven't considered that yet, but I will definitely take that account. Yeah, because there are, if with increase of diversity of plants, another organism start increasing as well. So yeah, and how that affects different results in levels of protein or biomass, that we haven't evaluated that yet. So we don't know.
Be also interesting to evaluate the effects of fire on biocrusts as well, and what the impact would be. And probably that would be intensity of fire, season of fire as well. There might be some relationships there to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So any other questions? If anyone has any questions, please post in the Q&A. I see there's lots of comments in the chat, but I think a lot of people are having some conversations back and forth. So if anyone has any questions, please throw them into the Q&A. Let's see if there's I'm just going through the Q&A here, Roy, see if there's anything that I can pull out as a question.
Yes.
Yeah, it's more of a conversation that's going on between people, which is great. People are answering each other. Oh, another comment. May say there was a question about mycorrhizae. Okay, thanks, May. I'll try and find it in there. Oh, question from Rob Garner, Roy, is do you think that forbs bring mycorrhizal benefits, helping the grasses grow better too?
Well, there are several studies that suggesting that increasing the diversity of plants, they may increase symbiotic effect on other organisms such as mycorrhizas. So yes, there are. I don't have the absolute values right now, but definitely, including forbs, they have mycorrhizal benefits. And of course, with the increasing the levels of mycorrhiza in those forbs, may increase the level of capture for other nutrients in the soil. And that, of course, with the symbiotic effect, they can interact with other functional groups such as grasses, of course, benefit those the growth of those grasses as well. So I will definitely say that mycorrhizas benefit grasses as well.
Okay. And then Clinton Blythe made another comment. He says, just as an observation, he says he notices that in October, Western snowberry becomes a significant component in the cattle manure in his pastures. So, and yeah, I've noticed that as well, that there's sort of that shift in browse in the fall. And I think your data, Roy, shows that the crude protein levels of shrubs in the fall still, maintains some higher level of crude protein, right?
Yes, well, we didn't evaluate the crude protein levels in shrubs, but in terms of the amount of biomass that shrubs provide, especially at the end of the growing season, is very high compared to the other functional groups. And there is one thing that several studies suggest, that in the absence of graminoids and forbs, cattle may go for additional choices of food. So in this case, snowberry might be one of the options. So definitely that's why probably he found in the manure some of these snowberries.
Great. Thanks, Troy. So any other questions? I'll sort of give it a last call for questions, and don't see anything popping up. So, well, thank you, Roy, for taking the time to present the research you're working on, the 2 projects that you're working on with the plant ecology lab at the University of Saskatchewan. So thank you very much, Roy. So I guess with that, our next session starts at 10:35. And we'll be having Karen Thompson from Trent University talking about the use of access mats for the mitigation of industrial activities on mixed soils and vegetation. So this actually gives everyone a great chance for a little bit of a break. Make sure you check out the trade show booths and also the poster sessions. And make sure you collect those gamification points as well. So we'll see everyone back here at exactly 10:35. Thanks.
Thank you, Rennie. Thank you all.
Hi, Karen. Oh, you're muted, Karen.
Darn it. Oh my gosh. Still after like 2 years of doing this. Oh my gosh.
Don't worry.
Anyways.
Are you ready to go, Karen?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, I'll introduce you. So hi, everyone. Welcome back after the break, and I hope you had a chance to check out the trade show and the poster sessions. Next up, we have Karen Thompson. Karen is an assistant professor at Trent University, where her research interests include the interactions of crops and microbes, functional resilience and recovery of soil microbial communities to disturbance and climate change, and also connecting microbial functioning with nutrient cycling and greenhouse gas emissions. This morning, Karen will be talking about the use of access mats for the mitigation of industrial activities on mixed grass soils and vegetation. So with that, I'd like to welcome Karen to the Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very nice for the nice introduction, Rennie. So yeah, thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to be presenting some research that I collaborated on through my postdoc position when I was at the University of Alberta. And I continue to collaborate with the group out in Alberta still now today. But I just wanted to first acknowledge that this research was funded through an industrial NSERC CRD grant in partnership with ATCO. And while I'm presenting this work as, you know, our kind of collective body of work, and I'm going to talk a lot about results that we found, I do want to highlight the fact that the majority of all the heavy lifting, the blood, sweat, and tears, all the actual work, most of it was conducted by our 2 awesome master students, Cassia James and Faizad Jaffe, who both successfully defended their masters a couple of years ago. So from this body of work, we have currently, I think, 3 papers published, a 4th under review, and a 5th in prep from me, and then another data set that hopefully we'll get to in the future. So it's been a pretty comprehensive project. So I'm going to try my best to communicate this in a clear manner. It is a lot of data and kind of like a lot of moving parts. Okay, so the work I'm presenting today was conducted within the mixed grass prairies of Alberta. And while grasses represent approximately 43% of agricultural land, or over 20 million hectares in Alberta, which seems like a pretty large number, this area actually only represents between an estimated 5 to 40% of its original area. So this is particularly worrisome. as native grasslands provide a plethora of different ecosystem goods and services, which I'm sure the majority of our audience are well aware of. But just to highlight a few, this is including storing soil carbon, mitigating greenhouse gases, providing habitat for biodiversity, including pollinators, having an effect on hydrology, so helping purify water and mitigate floods, and then as well as producing forage for livestock grazing. So, you know, considering all of these ecosystem goods and services we obtain from native grasslands, it's particularly troublesome as well that not only are these grasslands not well protected, but they are being increasingly altered and encroached upon due to population pressure and land use change. So these disturbances to grasslands are increasing, particularly through Alberta. And this includes things like agricultural land conversion, overgrazing recreation, urban industrial sprawl, as well as infrastructure development, including energy extraction and transmission construction. So when we have these kind of large scale disturbances occur, they often influence not only the plant communities, but also soil characteristics and the soil microbial communities, which then in turn change the ecosystem processes and associated functioning, and therefore those ecosystem goods and services that we have provisioned from our grasslands. So these disturbances to our native grasslands are also particularly concerning because grasslands store very large amounts of carbon. So globally, grasslands are estimated to store between 10 to 30% of the world's organic carbon pools. And the majority of this is below ground. So temperate grasslands are estimated to contain about 300 gigatons of carbon. 3% or 9 gigatons is in the above ground plant biomass, and the remaining 290 gigatons or 97% is in soils and the root biomass. And this is because this kind of large amount of carbon going below ground is because these perennial grasses have really evolved to have more biomass below ground. They put more energy and carbon into their roots. They have higher root to shoot ratios. So we see that through disturbances, including conversion to cropland, which is shown here from a University of Alberta benchmarking carbon study, that when we have changes from our native grassland, we can have distinct and sizable losses in soil carbon. Here we saw decreases of 28% and 45% in the prairie and parkland regions, respectively. And this is occurring, you know, through a couple different mechanisms. So we're having a breaking up of aggregates, exposing that carbon and nitrogen in the soil to microbial activity, and having that carbon be oxidized and or spired off. So considering what we know in general about disturbances impacting grasslands, particularly when we think about the bit of work that's been done for the oil and gas industry with looking at pipeline effects, we hypothesized that infrastructure development, including high voltage tower construction, would also have sizable impacts on the mixed grass prairies, including soils, vegetation, and microbes. So from 2013 to 2014, ATCO constructed a high voltage transmission line across Alberta, and these kind of activities are ongoing and multiplying all the time, in order to try and provide energy to the growing southern Alberta population. And part of this high voltage transmission line intersected through the University of Alberta's Matthias Research Ranch. So the Rangeland Ecology Research Group decided to do a bit of work with our industry partners at ATCO to look at the impacts of these type of activities on the prairie. So our first kind of major research question was, how does sod stripping, or also termed soil stripping, construction methods impact the mixed grass prairie? So in traditional kind of what we would call high disturbance tower construction methods, what occurs is that basically the soil is stripped from place so that it can create a level working surface. That soil, both the surface layers and the subsurface layers, are then stockpiled while construction activities are ongoing, Once construction is completed, then that soil is returned in the hopefully correct order. Again, the subsoil and then the surface soils above, and then revegetated. So the pictures shown here are some of our high disturbance towers that were constructed through the Matthias Research Ranch, where you can see that obviously this looks like a pretty big impact when we think that these soils were actually removed and not left intact, and then reseeded and revegetated after construction. Our second kind of major question was, how does heavy equipment traffic impact the mixed grass prairie and its recovery? So there's quite a bit of previous kind of gray literature and technical reports out of the States focusing on the impact of military tank traffics on soils. We've also seen quite a few studies looking at the impacts of different tractor weights on soils in agricultural settings, but few studies have been conducted within the mixed grass prairies. And further so, there have been very few studies only out of our group that have compared how heavy traffic might impact soils compared to some of the proposed best management practices for these kind of infrastructure development activities. Okay. So, not only did we want to see how tower construction and actual traffic impacted the prairie, but we also wanted to assess how access mats, which are a recommended best management practice or BMP from the government of Alberta, how these kind of access mats could help mitigate some of these potential disturbance impacts. So the government of Alberta has basically published guidelines that recommend the use of access mats to minimize disturbance to grasslands during different infrastructure development activities. These guidelines have been largely focused on the importance of trying to reduce land disturbance and also focusing on developing best management practices within industry limitations. So shown here, I'll just say that the picture in the middle is an internet grab. This is not a picture from our field trial at all. But basically these access mats are wooden boards. They can come in different materials and sizes, but the ones we used were 3-layer spruce. They were about 750 kilograms in weight and were roughly 2.5 by 4.5 meters in size. And these mats can basically interlocked, and were originally used for development on the saturated soils of the boreal forest, but are also increasingly used by industry to try and provide a durable work surface. So we have, a safe area for people to work on, and also allow access route to areas that might not allow traffic normally. So the idea behind these access mats is that they redistribute the weight of heavy equipment traveling on them, as well, again, as providing that durable and safe work surface. So the idea is that they should prevent soil rutting, should help mitigate compaction, and should also decrease the ripping of vegetation. And I also just want to note that these access mats can remain durable for over 500 passes, but they still represent a very high cost to industry, and we're not 100% certain of all of their kind of side effects or impacts. So just to kind of summarize, I'm going to be presenting some work looking at the tower construction methods, as well as looking at traffic impacts using both access mats and not. So the kind of joining theme here was the use of access mats. So the Eastern Alberta transmission line was constructed running northeast of Edmonton to south of Brooks, just kind of paralleling that yellow line, that's the highway, the larger kind of blow up of the map there. So this is the Matthias Research Ranch that is part of the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta. So when this tower line was constructed from 2013 to 2014, access mats were brought in to create these durable work surfaces and construction platforms. For this specific voltage line, the cost to our industry partner was over $64 million in mats alone, so not including the cost to move and clean these mats. So after the actual completion of the transmission line, the Rangeland Ecology Group kind of went out and looked at the landscape and found that in some instances when the access mats were removed, we were exposing bare soils, and this prompted the researchers to really question their utility in these prairies. So within the Matthias Research Ranch, we conducted 2 field studies, one looking at our in situ tower construction impacts, and the other being a controlled field study. So the first study is basically post-construction, where we were looking at the impacts of different tower construction methods. And so if you look on this map, the little red numerals, which you can't really read, but they're basically representing our different tower sites. So we had 15 high voltage transmission towers that were constructed within the Rangeland Research Institute's area. And that's kind of the first area I'm going to stop at. So along this transmission line, the high disturbance sod stripping methods, where again the soil is removed and stockpiled and then replaced and revegetated, were used in 5 locations where we had sandy soils with kind of rolling dune landscapes, and that kind of topography necessitated the leveling of the land to ensure that safe work area. So the high disturbance sod stripping methods were used at 5 tower sites, and that our remaining sites, which included both sandy and loamy soil sites, the tower construction used axis mat methods, where instead of removing the soils were left intact. Axis mats were placed on the ground for construction activities to try and mitigate all of the impacts of our heavy traffic. They were placed for up to 4 months during construction activities. And then at each of our 15 tower sites, we also randomly selected a random kind of undisturbed control area that was adjacent to the construction activities but not affected. So this then allowed us to compare the impact of the actual construction method comparatively to our undisturbed controls. And then we were also able to kind of compare the impact of our high disturbance methods to our low disturbance methods when we had similar soils. So we did a whole bunch of soil sampling and analysis. And again, by we, I mean it was mostly done by our wonderful students. And the picture on the left is FISA measuring penetration resistance. We also measured bulk density, so both bulk density and penetration resistance can tell us a little bit about the soil compaction. We also looked at water infiltration, which is really important in this very dry, arid ecosystem. We also collected soil samples and measured pH, salinity, carbon and nitrogen, as well as organic matter, which is an incredibly important indicator of soil health. We also installed nutrient supply rate probes, or PRS probes, which is basically an ion resin capture kind of system, so that we can measure both ions and cations throughout the growing season. And then the component that I actually was working on when I was there in my postdoc was the microbial component. So we also extracted DNA, and I used quantitative polymerase chain reaction, or qPCR, to enumerate the size of different microbial communities like fungi and bacteria and archaea and some nitrogen cycling groups. And then I also used Illumina-MiSeq sequencing to look at the diversity and community structure of some of these different groups. Our students also did an incredible amount of vegetation sampling and analysis. So basically the herb quantity was measured by harvesting biomass to the ground level within quadrats during peak growth of each growing season. And then the students divided the biomass into grasses, as well as native forbs and introduced forbs. They also looked at litter, which I'm not going to look at today, and they also hand sorted and sieved a whole bunch of samples to estimate root biomass. So just to kind of put the amount of work in perspective, in the second study I'm going to be looking at, so one of the 2 studies, just to collect the biomass for vegetation sampling each year took 4 students 10 days of work, so basically 40 work days just to collect the veg. So it was an incredible amount of work that these students did. So turning to some results, I will direct you to look within this red box. So if you look within the red box, you'll see that we're comparing or looking at the high disturbance soil or sod stripping method in sandy eco sites. And what we saw was that these type of construction methods led to an increased bulk density and water infiltration rates, with a really distinct decrease in soil organic matter and soil nitrogen compared to the control soils. And this is particularly, to me, concerning that we had a 50% loss in our organic matter, as it can take decades or longer to build up those levels again. So we did see obviously large impacts of this sod stripping type of construction method on our soils, which was fairly expected. When we looked at our low disturbance methods using access mats and keeping that soil in place instead of removing the soil, we saw that when these access mats were used on sandy soils, that basically all of our metrics were the same as our control soils. So they were definitely having a lesser impact compared to our sod stripping methods on our soils. Finally, we also saw a few changes between our soils between our soils in our loamy sites when we used access mats. So we did see a slight increase in bulk density and water infiltration rates. This is likely due to the fact that heavy equipment was, driven over these mats. Although they're buffering out some of those compacted forces, they're not 100% effective. And we also saw increases in infiltration rates, which might have been due to, as we'll see, changes in the above ground biomass and litter cover, which increased preferential flow. Looking at penetration resistance, interestingly, we found that although there was quite a bit of variability and that we did have a peak in June, there was not a direct significant effect of the tower construction methods on penetration resistance. Switching now over to some vegetation responses. If we look at herb biomass averaged over the 2 years of study, which is in the left figure, we can see that the high disturbance sod stripping tower construction method significantly reduced grass biomass, and this occurred for up to 2 years. While we also then saw, if we look on our both loam and sandy soils, that access mats helped conserve this grass biomass to levels seen in our undisturbed controls. When we break down this data a little bit more to the right over here, we can see that this decrease in grass biomass in our sod stripping plots also coincided with an increase in forb biomass, which was largely dominated by introduced non-native species. So this kind of represents to us that we had this increase in kind of weedy ruderal plant biomass in the first growing season after tower construction. As you remember those pictures, we opened up this big, nice niche and decreased competition for these ruderal species. So we could still see an effect of these high disturbance methods on grass biomass in 2016, but by 2017 we've seen seen the grass biomass rebound to levels seen in the control. So we also looked at root biomass. So we determined this for a couple different treatments, and we saw that overall our sod stripping treatment again decreased root biomass, which again makes sense as that soil was removed and then replaced. Whereas we saw that our axis matting tower construction methods did not decrease root biomass. So I'm just going to show this one little bit of microbial results. I'm a microbial ecologist, so it's my favorite bit, but we're still working on this paper, so I didn't want to get too far into this. But another component of this first study was that we wanted to assess how the impacts of our different tower construction methods impacted our soil microbial communities. So we used, again, qPCR and Illumina sequencing. And what's shown here is a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination of the soil fungal communities associated with different tower construction methods. So I don't want you to get bogged down by any of this. I basically just want you to realize that within kind of ordination space, the closer 2 points are within this space, the more similar those communities are. So what we saw, was that our fungal communities within our sod stripped soils were very distinct compared to all of our other communities. So this kind of large, impactful disturbance really did have an impact on these sensitive fungal communities. So, considering the key role that soil fungi have in mediating plant nutrient acquisition and soil carbon retention, combined also with that decrease in organic matter and decrease in soil nitrogen and root biomass that we saw in our sod stripping methods, we can really see that this is a non-sustainable tower construction method that we should try and avoid, because it might have large implications for ecosystem functioning at the landscape scale. Okay, so the key takeaways from this first in situ kind of post hoc tower construction study was that high disturbance sod stripping construction techniques have large negative impacts on soil, vegetation, as well as our soil microbial communities. Our low disturbance construction techniques using access mats seem to have a lesser impact on our mixed grass prairies, particularly in sandy soil. So they did a particularly good job in potentially mitigating some of these effects of tower construction in sandy soils. So, we saw though that there is some intricacies kind of involved here. So we also then wanted to know and follow up from this, while these access mats protect the soils, what are, the specific details about how the actual timing and the season or the length of their use might impact vegetation recovery. So going back again to our site where we had, at the Matthias Research Ranch, our very industrious students, Cassie and Fiza, also went out and established a randomized complete block design in order to look at some of these kind of follow-up questions about access mat use. So, from that first study, we saw that access mats might help mitigate some of these issues through infrastructure development, but it didn't really allow us to properly assess how the potential of access mats may impact compaction effects from heavy traffic, as we didn't actually have, an access mat with traffic atop versus just traffic kind of comparison. So that's what we were doing with this study. So after the ATCO transmission line was constructed, our master students went out and set up this replicated field site. So basically we had 2 sites in loam soils and 2 sites in kind of sandy loam soils. So we could kind of get a bit of idea about the impact of these different effects in differently textured soils, which are both represented within the mixed grass prairie and specifically our research ranch. So the 2 sites shown in yellow were established on loamy textured soils and were dominated by needle and thread grass, June grass, blue grama, and western wheatgrass communities. And then the other 2 sites established on more sandy loam soils were dominated by needle and thread, low sedge, and sandgrass. And we chose to replicate this trial again so that we could look at these different soil textures and we could also increase our statistical power. But the side effect of this was that we had a lot of work again for our students. So at each site, we had 11 treatments that were replicated 4 times. And then we had again our 4th site. So this resulted in 176 different plots. So the main disturbance effect that we tested in the study was the impact of heavy traffic, either driven directly on the prairie or over top of access mats. We wanted to also test the effect of the season of placement as well as the duration of placement of these access mats over the growing season, since we did see some bare soils after their removal in the in situ study. So we placed access mats on the prairie either in the spring for either 6, 12, or 24 weeks, or later in the growing season in July, again for 6 or 12 weeks. The heavy loader was driven on top of the access mats or on the bare soil for our non-access mat treatments at both the beginning and the end of each of these treatment periods for each of the corresponding treatments. So this gets a little complicated, but basically we would put down the mat, have our heavy loader drive on top of the mat, And then, for example, in our early season 6-week treatment, before that axis mat was lifted back up and removed, we would then drive again. In our early 6-week treatments that did not have axis mat, we basically did the same thing, just the axis mat wasn't there, so we had our bare ground. So it is quite confusing, but we had a limited number of traffic passes, but each treatment received the same amount of traffic passes, just at either starting early in the season or later in the season, and then for different durations between those kind of traffic passes. And the traffic was either a Komatsu wheel loader or a Caterpillar wheel loader, and they're both about 9.5 tons or so. Okay, so looking at some results of analysis, and I think I'm getting near to the end of my time, so I'll speed up a little. We found that heavy traffic directly applied to the prairie without the use of access mats. So this is the left-hand panel here. So it's our direct traffic plots versus our axis mat with traffic plots over here. And we found that when heavy equipment was driven directly on the prairie, we saw an increase in penetration resistance compared to our control plots, as well as compared to our paired axis mat plots. So interestingly, we didn't really see changes in soil bulk density in the top surface layers, but as we could definitely see, visual signs of compaction through, you can see those ruts there, and combined with the increases in penetration resistance, which we measured, which were at a much lower depth than our bulk density. This kind of might indicate to us that while grassland root biomass may have kind of helped buffer out some of the compaction effects in the top layers, that there were still the impacts of that heavy traffic, which we saw through compacted soils lower in the soil. We also looked at water infiltration rates, and we found that in most cases, direct heavy traffic without the use of access mats resulted in lower water infiltration rates compared to their access mats treatments. So I just bring those in here. So we can see basically all of these light gray bars are our direct traffic treatments. And then the darker gray bars beside them are their paired treatment that has access mat with the traffic driven over top. So again, we saw that direct traffic did have an impact on our soil properties. In a subset of plots, we also installed our PRS probes, which are again our ion exchange resin membranes. So we could measure our ion supply with minimal disturbance over the growing season. So we found varying effects of our different treatments on a number of our different both macro and micronutrients. But what I really wanted to highlight here was that we saw a huge increase in soil nitrogen, so in our nitrogen supply rates, within plots that had access mats placed for the entire growing season, so for 24 weeks, as well as significant increases in some of our later plots as well. Looking at root biomass under our axis mat plots, we did interestingly and kind of unexpectedly see some increases in root biomass in plots exposed to both direct traffic and traffic on top of axis mats. And shown here is again our root biomass in soils that had axis mats on top. And what I basically want to bring your attention to is that although we did see some other changes with increases in root biomass in some of our treatments, the big kind of takeaway is that we saw a significant decrease in our root biomass again in our season-long axis mat treatment. So again, having those axis mats for the entire growing season had large impacts. Turning to some more vegetation responses, we found that the limited number of traffic passes, so again, we had 8 at the beginning and 8 at the end of each treatment period, so 16 total, did not seem to really have an impact on grass biomass. And also interestingly, while the grass biomass did not really seem to have an impact or did not respond to direct traffic, we did see a decrease in native forb biomass initially. Contrastingly, though, when we looked at the use of axis mats, we used that using axis mats decreased grass biomass if placed for 12 weeks or longer in spring. And we also saw that there was an increase in introduced forb biomass in soils when they had access mats used early in the growing season for basically any kind of time. So we can see that here for our introduced forb biomass, we saw this increase in introduced forb biomass in our early applied access mat treatments, which we did not see in the later mid-season applied ones. So together, these results then imply that while native forbs may not be as tolerant to direct traffic, native grasslands are fairly tolerant to a limited number of traffic passes. Here was 16. So, while grasses may have suffered some damage at the time of direct traffic application, the new tiller growth from the remaining crowns may have limited declines in grass biomass. However, we did see once the mats were removed that vegetation was observed to promptly regrow. This likely occurred from grass rhizomes projected below the soil surface. But we also again saw this increase in introduced forb biomass during the first full growing season after access mat use, with the greatest increases in introduced forb biomass evident on matted areas where the previous native perennial grass had been reduced basically the most. So basically it appears that access mats, when they're placed for durations longer than 6 weeks, we have this kind of flush of both native and introduced annual forbs that are likely establishing from the seed bank due to decreased competition with grasses and that flush of available nitrogen. So this is really important to consider. So just shown here is our early 12-week access mat with traffic plot immediately after the access mat was removed in the top, then 6 weeks later, 12 weeks later, and 47 weeks later compared to our control plots. Okay. So aside from water availability, soil nitrogen is the most limiting factor for plant growth in the MGP. And in addition to seeing a macronutrient flush under extended access mat use, we also wanted to assess vegetation responses in response to soil nitrogen supply rates. So we regressed total biomass against nitrogen supply rates, and then also looked at our proportion of that biomass comprised of introduced forbs compared to our total nitrogen. So we found that while soil nitrogen supply increased with longer periods of access mat placement, we also saw that the total live biomass was positively related to soil nitrogen supply. But most importantly, which is shown here, that the largest proportion of biomass that was related to this increase in nitrogen supply was comprised of introduced largely ruderal species. So this is really important to note that if we do have these kind of long-term disturbances or long-term use of access mats, that we might be having kind of large impacts on changing the overall plant community, as we saw this kind of trend continue into 2017 under these long-term access mat use where the grass biomass still hadn't fully rebounded. Just a couple more little microbial results to share. So basically, shown here is the size of the nitrifying community as based on our ammonia monooxygenase gene as found through quantitative polymerase chain reaction. So again, remembering that we found this increase in flush and nitrogen that changed our plant communities and shifted to introduced forbs. We also saw that our plots using access mats also supported larger nitrifying communities, indicating that again we're shifting the potential microbial community dominance that might relate to large scale ecosystem functioning and also nitrogen availability in this sense. So looking at the final results I'll share for today, we also found that fungal communities were very sensitive to both types of disturbances. They were much more sensitive than bacteria and archaeal communities, although that's not shown here. But we also saw that actually I shouldn't say that. We also saw that there was changes in the relative abundance of different fungal phyla involved in carbon cycling and nitrogen fixation after both axis mat and direct traffic disturbances. And this included increases in the number of potential fungal plant pathogens compared to control soils, which may indicate that there might be long-term implications for ecosystem functioning after either type of disturbance. And you'll note we did see a large rebound in the fungal community in the second year of study after traffic was applied directly, which is interesting. So from this controlled study overall, our major kind of applied finding is that overall direct heavy traffic at the low frequencies that we used in our study had limited impact on vegetation, despite impacting our soils and soil microbial communities. While axis mats appear to be good at protecting soils, especially in sandy textured soils, they also do carry a risk of impacting vegetation by, changing soil nutrient dynamics and hydrology, and potentially opening up this niche for different plants to come in and dominate. So overall, it seems that early and short duration of axis mat use led to the best overall recovery of the mixed grass prairie, as you can see here in this picture, which is our early 6-week traffic with axis mat plot, 12 weeks after our axis mat removal. We also saw on all fronts that season-long, here being 24-week placement of axis mat, is very detrimental to the mixed grass prairie. It led to sharp increases in introduced forbs, declines in grass biomass, changes in soil conditions, and microbial communities. So overall, the study really highlighted the key role that season of placement and use and the duration of use of axis mats has on determining their impact on the overall mixed grass prairie recovery. So while axis mats may be more relevant to use in sandy soils, which are more prone to the impacts of direct heavy traffic from compaction, they should only be really used for short intervals, again, and only in the early season. Okay, so we're at kind of the end here, and I'm excited to see what kind of questions there are and see if we can answer them. But just to kind of recap, overall what we found is that the low disturbance tower construction methods using axis mats helped conserve soil and vegetation better than the conventional high disturbance method using sod stripping, removal and replacement. We also saw that although direct traffic in our very limited number of passes may impact soils, it really had a limited impact on vegetation. Overall, we saw that yes, axis mats can help mitigate impacts of disturbance on soils, but they should be used again for short durations and also early in the season to help try and mitigate some of these impacts. So with that, I would like to thank, we had a number of research assistants who helped us in the field and lab. Christian McIntyre also created some of the figures that were published in our papers. We also had a lot of help from ATCO staff, particularly Rajat, as well as Aaron Donovan and John Lewis. And if anyone is interested in looking more into the studies we have published so far, I do have them available and I'm happy to email them at anyone's request. So with that, I guess we go to questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Great presentation and some great research there, evaluating those best management practices and those recommendations, and sort of fits some of the concepts I've noticed over the years on access into some of these sites with heavy equipment. So we have a few questions in the chat. Some of them are in the question and answer. Some of them are from first part of your presentation. So maybe a little tougher for you to answer because there might be some specific questions. First one from Ivan is bulk density of low and high disturbance soils. For the sandy soils, low disturbance was 1.2, whereas high disturbance was 0.79. Any idea why so different in the same soils? So I think that was towards the beginning.
Oh, it's really far back.
Yeah.
No, went too far. Sorry. Oh, there we go. So we saw an increase. So sorry, the question was why the increase in the high disturbance sandy soils under sod stripping?
Yeah, why were they the same? Why were they different in the same soils type?
Okay, so the control soils were not impacted by the tower construction activities. They were like our control undisturbed check that we compared our characteristics under the actual tower construction site to. So they differed based on the tower. So like within each tower site, we had a control check. So is that why you're asking, like why they're different between the control on the Sandy HD and the control Sandy LD? I think that's what is being asked. So that's why like they're average of different values because they were actually different towers and different sites. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Karen. From an anonymous attendee, she wrote, you showed that increased bulk density leads to increased water infiltration. That seems to be counterintuitive to the person who asked the question. Would you please explain?
Sure. So the increase in bulk density didn't lead to increase in water infiltration. We just also saw increases in water infiltration. There are a couple of reasons why this could be occurring. So for example, on the sod stripping towers, because that soil was removed and stockpiled and then replaced, we basically didn't have a litter layer. We didn't have any kind of microphytic crusts. So we might have actually, increased preferential flow because of that kind of missing layer. Also because those soils were, technically they should have been, put back nicely in the same layer, but there might have been, some admixing. So potentially some changes in, porosity and aggregation. So they're not quite related, the bulk density and water infiltration in that way, or at least we're not assuming that they are, if that answers that question.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. Next question from May Elsinger. This is very interesting with some unexpected patterns that you've noticed. What do you think the effects would be of rainy year versus dry year? The more wetter soils in those situations?
Yeah, I think there would definitely, be different impacts because as we saw a lot of our large kind of impacts of traffic as well. We're seeing when traffic was applied early in the growing season when we had moisture soils where we're having that kind of spring water recharge. So I think that, yeah, even if we look at our penetration resistance, we saw quite a bit of variability, but it's also largely related to soil moisture. So we would definitely expect, to likely see differences in what we saw if we had, like a much wetter season or something like that. It was quite dry. This area gets like 354 millimeters of precipitation a year or something like that. Like it's a very dry area.
Yeah, I've been to the Matthews Ranch a few times over the years. It's a beautiful location, but it is pretty dry compared to other parts of Alberta. Question from Shirley Bartz. She says, thank you, Karen. Can you comment on what is going on with the larger rebound in fungal community in the sites with traffic directly on the grassland in the year following the randomized study?
Yeah, there's a couple different things that could have been happening, just that, that increase in compactive forces might have change the actual soil environment. So maybe we would have a change in the pore space ratio and the amount of oxygen and different resources available. It is interesting seeing that rebound, but the thing we kind of didn't pull out in this too was that in both of our types of disturbances is that we saw this huge increase in, a lot of fungal OTUs that maybe we wouldn't have expected to see such large amounts in these kind of environments, and a lot related to potential plant pathogens related to carbon breakdown. So even though we saw this like big rebound of the fungal community, whether they're the actual fungi we would prefer to have in that system is not quite clear yet. So we're still kind of working through some of that, but it was likely, due to some form of change in that soil environment, providing better resources for the fungi to kind of dominate over bacteria.
Good. There was a couple of questions related to placing the mats in the winter months versus spring or summer installation. What would be sort of the difference with a winter installation?
Well, I don't really, sorry, what do you mean the difference?
Yeah, so would have there been a less impact if it was installed in the winter versus installing in the spring?
Yeah, I think it would have a lesser impact, just because if those soils are already frozen and we don't have that already actively growing vegetation, we're not going to have potential impacts that way. But I honestly can't really speak to it. The only previous work that has been done using the access mats has largely been done on frozen soils, but using like military tanks in the States. And they only really looked at those kind of soil physical responses, not any of the like biological or veg responses. But I would think that if we could use access mats when the plants aren't actively trying to photosynthesize and grow, they might have lower impacts.
Thanks, Karen. Another question from an anonymous person was, what is the alternative to sod stripping? It sounds like it may be necessary to use in certain circumstances based on topography, etc.
Yes, so it is. And that's why the 5 towers we did have under sod stripping were constructed in that way, just because it was not feasible to use access mats due to the topography. There was just too many rolling dunes that would have made an unsafe work environment for the workers.
A couple more questions, and then we got about another minute yet. Did you compare the pitometer resistance under access mats to undisturbed control?
Okay, I'm trying to remember. So with penetration resistance, it differed between the studies because obviously we could only measure the penetration resistance as the access mats were brought up. So the different treatments had like different numbers of measurements total over the study period, depending on when the access mats were put down. Sorry, what was the question, Rennie?
Yeah, did you compare the resistance under access mats to the undisturbed control?
Yes, I believe we did. Let me just see if I go with this. Trying to remember what it looks like. Let's go back. Yes. Yes, we did. So, okay, on this little example plot, so this is on the left is our direct traffic plots with no access mats. On the right is with access mats. And you can see the little white triangle is our control plot. So it's the same kind of without. And you can see that in our access mat plots, we had kind of, similar penetration resistant values versus in our direct traffic plots, we had much higher values. That, yeah.
Great.
I think I answered that.
Yeah, you did. You did. Okay. You have a control, right? So
yeah.
That could be your
Sorry, it's been a couple of years.
Well, great. Well, thanks a lot, Karen. We're up with our time, so we'd like to take a little break before the next session or the next presentation. So thanks a lot, Karen, for presenting and joining us from Trent University, and very applicable research, especially anyone dealing with industrial sites in Saskatchewan or Alberta or Manitoba. So thank you, Karen.
And keep an eye out if anyone's interested in reading the papers. I'm happy to send them to you, and we have a couple more in prep that we're putting in soon. So
excellent. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Karen. And so we'll be back at 11:30 for a presentation from Kyle Bobbywash. So thank you, everyone, and please take a break. And Kyle's all excited. So thanks, everyone. Okay, hi, everyone. Thanks for the last 2 presentations. They're very interesting. And we're down to our last presentation of the morning. And so this morning we have Kyle Bobbywash, who is a member of the Mississauga First Nation and is an assistant professor and an Indigenous scholar in the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba. Kyle will be talking with us today about the Indigenous perspectives on conservation management through pollination biology and landscape biology lens. So thanks, Kyle, for joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you for having me. And maybe one caveat that I like to have early on is that, I'm not going to have a lot of super useful applied advice right off the bat. But what I'm hoping to get us to is the stage where we're thinking of conservation, pollination, habitat, and maybe a bit of a different way to start thinking about how we can potentially do this better at a broad scale. Right on, if you're here, I imagine I don't have to tell you how cool or how vast, grassland biomes are. But I do like to think about, I think it's important to understand the context to look at what was, what is right now, and thinking about the why, or, what resulted in this evolution or this degradation or the growth or the loss of certain components. When we look at the North American grasslands, right, we see, okay, it's pretty big, right? It's occupying that space between the Rocky Mountains and kind of that eastern deciduous forest where I grew up. And, if again, I don't have to tell anybody that we don't have a lot of certain of these grassland types left, right? If we look at tall grass prairies, we know we have, less than 1% left. Even prairie grasslands themselves, right? We've lost at least 70% of them. And these other, grassland kind of prairie-like, savanna-like habitats like sagebrush areas, we know we're not doing too well in being able to conserve them. When we think about something like tall grass, right? So, oh my God, at one point there was, probably 90 million acres of this land. That's a heck of a lot, or 90 million hectares. That's quite a bit of hectares, right? What I think now there's about maybe less than 2 million hectares of tall grass left. Where I grew up in Ontario, it's even more rare, right? In general, it just wasn't, it was competing with all sorts of other encroaching habitats. So there we have, maybe about 1,000 square kilometers left. It started at about 1,000 square kilometers, but less than 3 kilometers of that is actually, or less than 3% of that is still existent, right? Sometimes they're in these weird parks in downtown Toronto or in just kind of small little conservation areas. And something we think about, yes, we think about agriculture. We think about most of this tall grass community or some of these prairie communities having been lost over the past 200 years due to human landscape modification, primarily agriculture. Those are the things we like to think about, and it's true. I like to think more so about the species that we've lost, right? In Ontario, at least, I know about 20% of the designated species that are, either extinct or at risk, or, along that kind of continuum of being really endangered, are associated with these prairie habitats. This is not just a Canadian phenomenon. We can look globally. If we look at all the different grasslands here, in green, we can see just general the extent of grasslands globally. But then if we look at these kind of brownish splotches, we get, those are the degraded grassland habitats. So I know it's not super clear. It's not the easiest to see. But we can see wherever there's grasslands, there's quite a bit of degraded grasslands. We can probably estimate now that of that 40% of Earth's surface that's covered in grasslands, about 50% of them are degraded, right? That's just, they're not producing, biomass. They're not producing their ecological functions. They're not supporting biodiversity as effectively as they are. If we look at some of these small examples, like in North America or South America, in the United States, we're seeing our tall grass prairie transformed with a mixture of C3 and C4 grasses, or from C3 to C4 grasses to, generally exotic Eurasian C3 grasses, right? We're getting lower biodiversity. In Brazil, just the cultivation, that transformation of agriculture, or the transformation of prairie to agriculture, or grasslands to agriculture, and then the abandonment of that area due to the speed at which it loses its fertility, results in these really kind of garbage desert savannas that really don't do anything. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, we know we've been working and transforming grassland habitats for a long, long time. Our idea was to increase their productivity, sure, right? We've done that by selecting certain species. So we're creating these improved grasslands, but they're not quite as robust in terms of being able to provide ecosystem services or ecological functions. And we saw actually in the first talk when we were talking about normalized difference vegetation indexes, right? NDVIs, when we were looking at how we can measure potential biomass creation using remote sensing data. If we take that global perspective and we look at areas with declines in biomass production, again, we see a lot of them associated with these areas of grasslands, right? We know that globally, humans have induced biomass productivity losses by about 25% in all these kind of savanna to grassland-like habitats. And humans, they affect all sorts of habitats, but like we know, grasslands tend to be not only the most endangered, but also the most affected. And beyond that, if we look at some of these areas where there are a lot of this decline in biomass or degradation of their ability to be productive, a lot of these areas are a lot more reliant on those ecological systems or on those ecosystem services or on agriculture or food production that's dependent on these grassland habitats. Between 2001 and 2011, the degradation of grasslands have cost the livestock industry globally about $7 billion, right? That's just lost in production because these grasslands were not able to fuel that primary productivity necessary for something like cattle production. And it's crazy to me that the thing that we're reliant on the most, food, for example, is the thing that we are using to drive the extinction of the habitat that provides that fuel, right? That provides that foundation upon which we get our fuel. If we're thinking of just the northern Great Plains, 53% of the area remains intact. Okay, that's a little bit better than tall grass prairies, but we know 87% of this intact land, again, is in really bad conditions, in poor or marginal quality soil. It probably doesn't have a lot of future potential for agriculture. The areas that are already converted to agriculture, again, are being farmed pretty intensely as we're putting corn, soybean, wheat, canola, these really intense things. And I'm from a faculty of agriculture. I do a lot of agricultural production projects. So I'm not trying to vilify agriculture in any way, but I think there's an opportunity here to see how we have developed things, how we've developed not only our agricultural system, but our countries and our mentality towards these things to improve conservation a little bit. So, like I said earlier, we know the vast majority of grassland losses in North America occurred prior to the 1930s, right, or the early 1900s. But we know even prior to that, there's been a long time prior to the 1930s, there's been this slow degradation of our land or slow transformations of our land to something like farm systems. What I'm showing here are all the different advertisement materials that were used by both the United States and Canada to encourage settlers to take up all this free, open, expansive Western, prairie habitat, and let's start a homestead, start a farm. There's all this fantastic land. There's this free land that will offer all of these new settlers or colonial colonists to start this farm, start to settle the rest of Canada. And yes, we talk about agriculture often, but we don't talk about the change in ownership or the change of that management regime from a particular group of people to these nations that eventually became Canada and the United States. And I think this is a really important component and concept that we tend to ignore because we can make these bigger, political, economic, ideological arguments to think about when things become, these sources for industry, these economic drivers, we tend to lose sight of what they might actually be producing. This is a really cool paper by Farrell and al. That looked at, that land that was historically managed by Indigenous people and the amount of land that is currently, administered in some senses by Indigenous people. So, like something like the tall grass prairie, 99% of land has been lost to Indigenous people. There's only, tribes from historical period that have no recognized present day land base. Almost 50% of Indigenous people have no land, right? People that were really integrated into their landscape through hunting, through farming, through natural resource extraction, right? 50% of them nearly have no land. What I find more, equally as fascinating are these trends we're seeing globally with something like extreme heat, where we have many more days of the year that are in excess of 100 degrees. Similarly, we're seeing some mean annual precipitation decreases present day relative to this historical period prior to colonialism. And, I can't talk about colonialism without talking about it as being this driver for some habitat modification, some habitat degradation. One of the key ideas that were used to push and kind of encourage people to settle the Americas was this idea of the pristine myth. This idea that North America was empty and full of opportunity. All these ecological systems that seemed so productive were placed there just by chance, by God, just by natural states or natural relationships with the land. These things happen naturally. But the more we start to look into a lot of these things, this is some old work by William Denevan, we can see that so much of our landscape was already manipulated, managed, utilized, optimized by Indigenous people. So this is just some archaeological reviews that show all sorts of different major infrastructure, agricultural modification, landscape modifications happening on the land. So you see raised fields, terrace zones, mounds, all sorts of different things. If we start to incorporate something like fire, which we know is probably one of the most used tools, and probably should still be one of the most used tools in land management, we can start to see, all sorts of different people using all sorts of different groups using fire for different reasons, right? In the Amazon, they use it to really modify their multi-crop systems. In Northwest Ontario, we're focused on utilizing it for berry production. Somewhere like the interior of British Columbia, they're using it for specialty fruit crops and small game birds, right? Those are the traditional uses within these landscapes. And it wasn't just fire, being this single tool. Oftentimes, fire was, integrated with other types of management techniques, like trapping, right? You created these spring burns to not only increase that biodiversity through encouraging early successional habitat, but you're creating these you're creating these corridors that can be used by animals and by trappers to actually access these areas. There's, traditionally in Indigenous cultures, there's really some awesome land use mapping that happened in communities to really make sure that we're optimizing these resources. When we incorporate something like fire onto the landscape, we see some pretty big chunks, right? Compared to the Denevan work from the early 90s, if we incorporate something like fire here in the dark hatched areas, we see, oh my God, all that Midwestern area, was intensely managed by Indigenous peoples. Right, and this is a habitat that there's so little of, just like the tall grass prairies. But in my mind, it was one of the coolest habitats. Right, this is the habitat where we had our only North American or our only United States parrot variety. Right, the Carolinian parrot lived in these really cool oak savannas. So pre-colonization, we had about 50 million acres of this oak savanna in the Midwest. Right now, we know that there's, maybe a little bit less than 1% of it. The vast majority of this habitat now is agriculture. Yeah, and and I like to think of this, I've worked a lot more in savannas than I have in prairie habitats, but I think there's a lot of similarities here, right? We're encouraging that early successional habitat. We're making sure that there's limited canopy. We have a lot of those same species that are incorporated into it. A lot of these savannas are kind of that barrier between forest, temperate forest, coniferous forest in the Northwest, and some of these more grassland-like habitats. And just like prairie habitats, we have all sorts of really cool, unique specialists that tend to congregate here. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time here. But getting back to that fire component, right? Again, oak savannas, just like the prairie habitats, there is a human component in terms of managing them. When I'm looking at something like my own language, Anishinaabe-Mowin, we have all sorts of words to characterize different types of fire, different temporal or ages of fire. When we look at languages from neighboring groups, we see that a lot of our words are shared, right? So not only were these words things that allowed us to codify our own practices, but what we're seeing in linguistics is that there's a lot of shared words for a lot of practices that were relatively similar across all of North America. And even when we don't have a lot of something like, long-term knowledge about some of these practices, we can still see the effects of fire management or habitat management in the landscape or in the ground sometimes, like in this example. What we see on the left and on the right are, two different soil pit profiles. On the left, we just have a typical normal soil profile. This is what it looks like. On the right, what we have is this soil pit from a garden area. So this area hasn't been gardened recently prior to Brooks doing this. It was probably about at least 100 to 50 to 100 years since it was actually actively farmed or gardened or used. But even after all that time, we see a complete loss of all these soil horizons from B to CK, right? We see this homogenization of this soil layer right here, right? So we see all sorts of mixing. So everything that's growing on top of that, the ecosystems that are formed from that diversity created from all this nutrient mixing and upwelling from the lower layers, benefited from indigenous practices within this land. And and I do like to talk about these things globally, and I don't know if anybody has read this story or heard about this story, but this was one of my favorite papers 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I guess now, was this idea that American colonization cooled Earth's climate. Yeah, sure, a really catchy title. But I think what it introduces is this really interesting concept of the change in land use intensity in the Americas. So what we see on the left is land use prior to colonization. So the purple represents, or the darker colors represent more intense land use, and the lighter colors represent less intense land use. But something that we can also see looking at the pre-colonization to the post-colonization phase is that not only is there less intense land use, but there's also just less land use in general. So at the same time, we know we have all sorts of really cool ways to actually reconstruct the global mean temperature from northern and southern hemisphere proxies. So that's what this top figure on the top graph, or the top trend line here shows, is just the CO2 anomaly, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere at the time. So in this yellow area, in this yellow band, what we see is that intense colonization period where indigenous people, where we saw that decrease in land use management by indigenous people. At the same time, what we see is a huge dip in the temperature. Why might this have happened? If anybody knows, you can feel free to guess, type into chat. Why might this have happened? Well, I don't want to spend too much time on the slide, but the increase in an increase in carbon sequestration, right? That CO2 was being sequestered because indigenous forests or those landscapes or those prairie habitats or those savanna habitats that were managed by indigenous people became lost. So fire, of course, encourages that early successional no tree habitat. The overall loss of all these management systems or that management intensity drove an increase in, or a complete change in an increase in carbon sequestration. Right? So all this carbon sequestration reduced the greenhouse effect, therefore resulting in that little ice age that we saw in the mid 1500s to the late 1600s. Right? So the complete change in regime of who and how land was being managed during the colonial period affected the global climate. And why I like to talk about this is because it's important to understand that everything we do, whether it's conservation, agriculture, science, is a mutualistic interaction. I study bees. That's what my lab studies, right? I don't study indigenous people or maybe a lot of these global effects. So I study bees. So I'm very focused on mutualisms, right? A plant benefiting from a pollinator while a pollinator benefiting from all those beautiful nectar and pollen resources that a plant is providing the pollinators, right? So this really cool mutualistic interaction. So I like to kind of look at ecological interactions as a way to gauge whether we're doing something properly, right? Of course, you don't want to be a parasite on things, right? You don't want to gain all the benefit while you harm some other entity or some other component, right? And you don't want to, you also want to minimize your competition where both species lose out. So as we start to plan, as we think about conservation management and the way forward for development of agricultural lands or things like that, I think it's important to think about ourselves as these species being interactors with different ecosystems. And one of my favorite stories about humans being this mutualist is this mutualisms on mutualisms example by Lopez Uribe. So what the yellow in this figure represents is the original range of this stinking gourd, right? This cucurbit right here. But what Lopez and Uribe did is they identified all the current range of this squash specialist, right? So this bee only ever visits squash plants. Well, so this is kind of our only, native cucurbit at the time, but this range for the specialist squash bee is pretty diverse, right? And when we sample at all sorts of different sites, we can identify all these places where this bee has progressed. So how did this bee get to cover the entire United States and most of Mexico? Well, it's through the movement of squash by people that resulted in that expansion of the range for this specialist pollinator, right? The humans didn't bring them, but the humans and their expansion of agriculture actually increased the abundance, the range of this specialist squash pollinator. And that's what we should be doing when we're thinking of how to manage things. We should be looking to be identifying resources that we can play a really important role into propagating or expanding, right? We know squashes lost their only propagator, mastodons, right? Mastodons, mammoths, when they went extinct. So at that time, when mastodons and mammoths went extinct, humans were the only means for propagation and migration and movement, seed dispersal of squashes. So as humans started to create these really strong interactions with squash, we started to select and evolve and develop that genetic pool of squash. Right, so now we have all sorts of squash varieties. We have all sorts of heirloom varieties. Some that are used for arts and crafts, some that are used for water, some that are used for ceremonial purposes, and all sorts of great delicious squashes, right? So humans are these potential mutualistic interactors with other species within the environment. Going back to my, my savanna example, a system that I like to think about, we know something like pollen limitation is uncommon in many savanna ecosystems. Similar in a lot of prairie ecosystems, those that are relatively intact see levels of pollen limitation that are a little bit less than in other types of habitats. And that's important to think about because wild pollination is just so important. So this is just different agricultural areas with 115 leading crop species worldwide. And what these circles represent are different reliances on wild insects or honeybees. So if it's completely pink, it's completely reliant on wild insects. If there's green in there, it's reliant on honeybees. So what we can see in some areas, there's a good mix of both honeybees and wild pollinators being the main pollinators of these crops, but there's quite a few areas where wild pollinators are really important. So I think you can imagine I'm going to this point where I'm trying to say that wild pollinators are especially important. But I did want to touch on one methodological idea, because I'll be talking about it for a slide or two, is this: how do we measure how good pollination is? Well, in my mind, it's pretty simple. We look at what does that local pollinator community provide in terms of yield when just the pollinator, and what does the yield of this plant or the seed crop of this plant look like when we not only allow all the pollinators to visit it, but we really max out its pollination by putting all sorts of pollen on a toothbrush and pollinating every flower. And when we do this, of course, in some examples, we get all sorts of huge yield deficits. The space between the yield given by the actual pollinators, that local community, and the yield we get when we maximize pollination can be pretty huge in certain landscapes, right? In a small little blueberry crop that we did, $15,000 per acre was lost because there was just not enough pollinators. Oh, I'm going to go back to the global scene for one moment here, just to allow us to think about, pollination deficits are not evenly spread. We see communities that are reliant on ecological services like pollination are much more represented in the developing world, right? So the reliance on nutrients or products from pollination follows a similar trend. They're much more reliant on pollen dependent agricultural systems, and we're seeing an increase in production deficit due to losses of pollinators. Pollination deficits are not rare, right? We can see this in all sorts of different crops. We know that pollinator deficits can be related to pollinator visits, right? The more pollinators we have, the smaller that deficit's going to be. That's not always the case, even in my own work, right? Sometimes we just get these weird years. And why we get these weird years is because not every pollinator influences the crop in the same way. We have this idea that diversity increases function. So if we just look at all these roots, we can see these roots are probably accessing resources in all sorts of different ways. And pollinators are the same way, right? The functional diversity, the traits, the characteristics of these bees are going to result in them accessing different flowers. They're going to be pollinating in different qualities or at different rates. Some bees might, pollinate a flower faster. Some bees might deposit pollen faster. If we look at, something like leafcutters relative to bumblebees to honeybees, we see that they not only do the number of flowers visited per minute change differs, but we also see the number of pollen grains deposited can differ a lot. So if I'm a plant, right, this is going to be really important to me. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is to better understand how insects are utilizing these resources and contributing at that small nuanced scale. How are they depositing? How does one bumblebee compare to a honeybee versus another small wild bee? Right? We know there's going to be a lot of differences there. But there's not only differences in their value to us as farmers or as conservationists trying to protect and save certain species, but the value of those plants are really different. If we just look at these two examples on the far side, on the far left and the far right, we have two bumblebee species, a huntii and a vosnesenskii. They're in the same landscape, but the average number of pollen grains on the bee is going to change, and the species they're targeting is going to change. With the bumblebee on the left, they're focusing on rose pollen in the same habitat, right? In the same blueberry habitat in this example. But then the bumblebee on the right, she's only interested in blueberry pollen, right? So there's these preferences to how a species is going to utilize or prefer certain plants. And we can do some general characterizations, right? Oh, large body shape, long tongue, all these characteristics will influence something like a long tongue bee or a specialist bee. We know maybe it's just generally good to have an open, easy access flower to, promote all sorts of diversity. So we're not, blocking anybody out. If we want some of these specialists, might want to have a long tongue bee, so we might need to plant flowers in our habitat restorations that have long floral tubes, right? We're getting all sorts of information like this. We know there's these general ideas that allow us to do this, but I think our management needs to think about this a little bit more in depthly, because even bees themselves, not only do they prefer different flowers within the landscape just based on all sorts of different colors, nutrient profiles, shapes, sizes, but they're also going to see different levels of the landscape. One of the relationships that's becoming really important, especially in a lot of our work, is this fact that a small bee is not going to see the landscape the same way a large bumblebee might. Right? So this bee that might have maybe a 400-meter range might not ever see our habitat restoration that's 600 meters away from its nest, while a bumblebee that's maybe going a kilometer to 2 kilometers, it's going to see a bigger range, so it has a better opportunity to see some of these restorations that we might put into the field. So we're trying to incorporate all these different effects of farm landscapes to encourage pollinator biodiversity and also start to target pollinator health. And what do specific pollinators need, what they can perceive, and how can we provide that to them in a really effective way. Some of the work by my student Massimo is just basically driving around Manitoba, catching bees, as much as he can. On the left, this is on power lines. So when we look at something like the bipole power lines in Manitoba, you're creating these quasi-savannas, these quasi-prairie habitats through cutting all the trees that this power line is going to go through. So this habitat is managed for this early successional habitat. Similarly, on the right, we have these really intensely managed, or they're maybe mildly managed roadsides, right? So he's looking at all these roadsides that are mowed, their trees are removed to kind of create this kind of quasi grassland scrub habitat. So he's looking at these different habitats, not natural habitats, nothing too super special about them, but he's finding a whole whack of pollinators within them, right? So in his power line study, he's finding not only a lot of bees, but also a lot of pollinating flies, especially when we're looking at abundance, right? Abundance and richness on flies seem to be almost up there, almost at the same level as bees. On the roadways, this work is generally a little more southern. We're seeing a lot more bees dominating the system. So that just gives us some ideas of, what are these habitats actually, or what are these quasi-savanna scrub habitats actually providing to pollinators? So we're seeing differences between the different types of plains or prairies or boreal shield habitat. We're seeing differences in diversity on the bottom, differences in pollinator abundance as we go through these different habitats. We're seeing obviously the plant richness, right? The types of plants there and the abundance of plants are going to differ, but something that's interesting, some of the more, I would say, managed areas, the IBM sites, a lot of their plant species diversity equals that of many of our pasture fallow sites, these sites that are generally not managed, right? These more wild rehabilitated sites. Even with these managed sites, we're able to maintain some of that plant diversity. Even more interesting though, it's only in the managed sites, right? There's integrated vegetation management site where we see greater bee abundance, right? We're seeing just general overall greater bee abundance in this managed site relative to our kind of untouched pasture fallow sites. So why might that be? Well, we have no idea. This is a work to come. Massimo just submitted his thesis, and we're still working all sorts of data to get all sorts of fun publications out. But going back to our savanna system, in my previous lab, we looked at how abundance and diversity is not always what we might predict. So Julie Ray's work showed that in urban areas, right, these areas that are with the clear circles or clear squares, tended to have a lot more species richness in terms of bee diversity and plant diversity. And we know certain bee species are going to be associated with different types of resources. So that's where we're looking at, this is where we're going right now. We're trying to really get down to these nuanced details to start to identify these relationships between pollinators, their plants, and those particular resources that they're doing or that they're providing. So we're incorporating pollination networks, right? We're identifying which bee is using what plant. We're trying to do this not only by looking at bees and observing this in the field, but collecting the pollen off bees to understand how they're incorporated into these networks. We're trying to simplify a lot of this complexity to some extent by adding more complexity, but really getting that, getting that whole resume, the whole summary of what that bee's doing in the landscape. So we're creating all sorts of really cool pollination networks to try to understand what plant species are really important for certain bee species, right? To try to identify, these quasi-keystone species to just allow us to better understand what is everything providing, what is everything doing in that ecosystem. We're also trying to identify these nodes, right? Or these species that seem to connect our different habitats or really seem to synergize certain relationships. So we're seeing all sorts of things like that. Again, this is a lot of early data where our graze sites differ significantly, where we see certain plants being really important in certain sites and not so important in other sites. So we're trying to disentangle why species are differing in their importance across many of our sites to really start to identify management techniques and how that relates to bee perception of habitat. So, what makes a good plant pollinator community network? We know something like diversity and abundance of floral resources is really good. We want to plant things that have resources that are year round, but I think there's a lot more to those questions. And when we look at some of these bigger, broader ecological networks, we know there's a lot of unexpected relationships that come into these, even in those, in the early ecological networks that Elton did in the kind of Arctic areas, right? There's just so many potential influences to drive plant diversity, plant health, insect diversity. So we're trying to connect not only all these ecological elements, but we're also trying to incorporate humans into these ecological networks through different covariates and through different management intensity covariables to be able to understand the role that humans actually play in the landscape. Already, if we're looking at these ecological networks, oh my God, that's a lot of work. But we need even more work, right? Us in our lab, we need even more data to kind of create these pollination networks to be able to start to disentangle some of these relationships. We need to start looking at the quality of the resources and what these plants are actually providing to be able to do more and more specific hypotheses and to test different theories to understanding why certain species are more important than others or why certain patterns are developing. So beyond that, I'm, again, being the Indigenous scholar in our faculty, I'm trying to create these opportunities for Indigenous communities, Indigenous people to not only participate in conservation of land, but really to reinvigorate a lot of these food systems that were lost. We're seeing this happen all over Canada where, food culture like the, wild rice is being developed. This is being reinvigorated, this culture. If you go out to the Okanagan, stop at my favorite winery here, Inkamip, right? This Indigenous owned winery that not only has really fantastic vineyard production, but it also has really awesome conservation practices. So when we're thinking about conservation, science, and, what are those principles that we think about, objectivity, transparency, all these things, also think about some of these values that all of our cultures have, right? In my culture, we have the 7 grandfather teachings, which are maybe our fundamental principles. wisdom, bravery, love, honesty, truth, respect, humility. Almost every global culture, every global ethnic group will have many of these things in their own cultural norms or those cultural teachings, right? So how do we make sure that we incorporate this into that knowledge generation system, that science, that conservation practice that we're doing in the future? You know, we need to think about these things and find where we can, you know, ally and kind of set that course for the future together, right? Indigenous knowledge values often align better with our ideas of conservation rather than our ideas of, you know, something like our conventional or historical agricultural production or natural resource extraction, right? We can start to identify all these opportunities and build projects, right? This is just an idea of all the bee samples we have in Manitoba relative to the rest of Manitoba, right? We have very few bee samples or ideas of what bees are even in these environments. And in the red, we can see all these communities, right? So in my mind, these are unexplored partnerships that we can create and not only build more resilient ecosystems, but we can also build more resilient communities through increasing and encouraging more food security and sovereignty. So that's where I like to end. You know, we often don't think about a lot of these, you know, political and historical issues on the landscape, but it's through utilizing these good ways of knowing and being and acting on the land that we can start to identify ways forward for all of us to start benefiting and conserving a lot of these habitats. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, thank you, Kyle. You can really see your passion and energy. Thank you for sharing and sharing your story with us and your knowledge. Yeah, very, very informative, and also I think it opens up a lot of eyes for people too to look at things with a different lens, and both from that Indigenous lens, but also looking really down at the insects and looking at the diversity of insects and the story that they tell as well. Your story about the mastodon spreading squash as the carrier for the squash, that I've never heard that one before, so that's great to hear. So we got a few questions in the Q&A. Actually, question before we start. From a citizen science perspective, is there a place that is best to collect data on bee species, like maybe capture images so that the data could be used by researchers like yourself? Do you know of anyone?
Oh, well, best place to do it in person or best place to submit the data?
It's the best place to submit the data. So if you take a picture of a bee on a wildflower, is there a citizen science app that you'd recommend or some way to share that data?
Yes, so I will say we're still at that stage where everybody wants to have the app, or everybody wants to have the website, or everybody wants to have the database. But if you're doing things locally, maybe something to synergize would be to, you know, talk to those researchers at the nearby university. Ask them what they're using, right? Ask them what they're using for their biodiversity assessments, because a lot of that local data is going to be used by the local researchers more so than somebody like me, right? So I'm going to go on the big databases, iNaturalist and things like that, and or Bumblebee Watch or something like this, or Bug Guide, all these things like that, and kind of identify things like that. But to make it the most impactful, I think find those local researchers that just need data, right? Because I would love for somebody to find me this one particular fly or one particular bee that I'm looking for that might not interest anybody else. So you being in that area, and I think associating that with people doing that work, I think that's probably the best way. So I wouldn't give a recommendation beyond that. Okay,
no, that's great, Kyle. And I put a challenge out to my colleagues in Manitoba to connect with Kyle to look for some of those species that he's looking for. Okay, so first question from Shirley Bartz is a very cool discussion on mutualisms. The specialist squash pollinator moving across North America is fascinating. I had no idea that mastodons and mammoths disperse squashes in North America. Question is, have you done any work with squash RE bee genetics to look at changes or mutations in their DNA to possibly get an idea of which bee squash populations are older? And the reason she goes, I asked this because this might date the spread of the squash and bees and peoples across North American landscape.
You know, it's a great question. It was a really interesting paper when it came out. So I was still in grad school when the paper came out, and I had this brilliant idea. And then, oh, this paper came out a couple months after. So it kind of left me a little bit, whatever about it. But I think that's actually a really good approach. And And I think there's some interesting value there to really allow us to talk about a lot of this migration and this movement and the evolution of agriculture in North America with a little bit of more nuance. So I haven't, but especially now that I have my own lab and we have all these cool molecular tools, it's something that is probably fairly high up in my mind. Maybe not necessarily with these bees, but looking at different communities, especially say in the southwestern United States, where we have all these plateau agricultures in the mesas, and you have all sorts of cool island biogeography. I think there's a lot there that, you know, mutation rate or relatedness between populations might be able to tell us about all this really cool historical agricultural information, or the evolution of agriculture and its interactions with biodiversity and humans.
Great, thanks, Kyle. Question from Maddie is, could the greater bee abundance in industrial vegetation sites, so like the power lines, compared to the pasture sites, be due to people keeping, growing horticultural gardens, therefore a greater abundance and diversity of plant species in bloom at any given time?
Yes, so I didn't describe these IVM sites, these integrated vegetation management sites. That's what Manitoba Hydro calls them for the most part. There's not a lot of habitat improvement or any at all. Basically, it is just more targeted, maybe more intense cutting down of trees and shrubs, and a lot more mowing potentially. So it's called integrated vegetation management. They're not all perfectly managed with all sorts of diverse not each site is diversely managed. Some are just mowed and things like that. But I think they're keeping those sites, just that practice, however broad it might be, is really maintaining these habitats at a particular early successional stage, which I think in our particular area is just a really big boom relative to all that forest habitat around us, right? There's not a lot there besides, you know, these roadsides or these power lines, right? There's not a lot of sprawling prairie integrating into these forests. So a lot of times these are their only habitats with a lot of these floral resources. So, you know, I don't think this trend would hold up everywhere, depending on like how diverse our habitats are. But I think there's something there to think about. What might this represent in your own area, depending on that landscape composition that you might have. So I think there's all sorts of, it's better than what's there without the power lines, it seems.
Yep. Great, that sort of diversity in ecotones and habitats. Yeah. Very interesting. Thanks, Kyle. Next question from Shirley is, can you talk more about trends or patterns you're seeing in your data around the question of keystone pollinators or plant species for pollinators?
Yeah, well, this is a fight we had right down to before Massimo submitted his thesis. When can we call something a keystone, or when can we call it an important species? And I think there's quite I don't want to say a debate or an argument or a disagreement in the literature, but you know, what makes a keystone species, right? We talk about them so, well, we'll put them on stamps, we put them at the beginning of park entrances and things like that. And we're looking at a lot of our network metrics at, you know, we have these communities, you know, these composition matrices. How do we evaluate a species as being important for other species? Right now, we're only looking at the positive effects that maybe an abundant species has, or a species, say a flower species that has a lot of flowers. So yeah, for sure, it's going to be connected to a lot of other generalist pollinators that are going to use it. But might it also be increasing competition amongst those pollinators, limiting the opportunity for new pollinators to get in there? In my mind, that's a really bad keystone species, right? Because encouraging this competition for a limited resource. So we're struggling, we're trying to associate some of these big network ecology terms like modules and hubs and nodes to actually figure out what that actually represents biologically or ecologically on the ground in terms of interspecific interactions between not only other plant species, but other pollinator species and in between. So we're looking at figuring out new ways to utilize all this cool network data to actually be able to answer this keystone question or importance of species question a little bit more accurately.
Thanks, Kyle. So I'll do one more question. We have a couple more in the chat, but I'll just do one more. We're at the end of our time. But from Jessica is, are you tied with the bee surveying and data collection in the United States? I know there's a big push and a hub of people who are working to get bee surveys going and a collection of what is found there.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're referring to anything specific, Jessica, but most of my PhD was with the Integrated Crop Pollination Network. We were the only Canadian representative, so a lot of my PhD work was from that. And we just had a paper, well, it was more of a data paper where there's, I don't know, 100 references on it, and there's a lot of just aggregation of our data. And we had a pollen paper that came out with some United States and European partners. So yeah, I think it's really important. I think the point you bring up is really important. I think the collaboration needs to happen a little bit more broadly. Previously we did have the Canadian Pollination Network. That's where I got most of my master's training. But it takes a lot of money, right, to create this network that not only brings together researchers, but can fund that new generation of students. So I'm hoping somebody else is leading the development of that, but I think we're...
Oh, I think Kyle froze on us. We'll see if he's... Oh, we lost Kyle in mid-sentence, so sorry about that. So I'm sure he'll pop back, but I guess with that, we'll end our session for the morning, and that ends the habitat session. So I hope everyone enjoyed the session and learned some interesting facts and information about different research and different projects going on in Western Canada. Sorry about that, Kyle. We lost you there for a second. So we're going to end the session. It's lunchtime, so I'd really encourage everyone to get out and check out the trade show and the poster session. And Carolyn had thrown in the chat what the gamification code was for today, which happens to be our final day of the sessions. So you may want to enter that gamification code. So we'll regroup at 1:20 p.m. Saskatchewan time, and for the case studies. Also, Carolyn just posted that there's 2 big prizes left, so you may want to get your points in there really quick. So take care, everyone, and we'll catch you at 1:20 p.m. Saskatchewan time.